What if I told you that sometimes the biggest act of courage isn't staying and fighting, it's knowing when to run? What if the person you think you're supposed to marry turns out to be your prison warden, and your only escape comes in the form of a stranger's truck on a rainy night? This is the story of Clara Bennett, a woman who had everything money could buy, but nothing her heart actually wanted. Picture this. You're standing at the altar in a dress worth more than most people's cars, about to marry a man who sees you as nothing more than a business transaction. Your family's future depends on this moment. Everyone's expectations are crushing down on you. And suddenly you realize that saying "I do" means saying goodbye to everything you've ever dreamed of becoming. So, what do? You run. But here's where this story gets really interesting, because when Clara ran from her gilded cage, she crashed straight into the life of Alexander, a man with secrets darker than her own. A billionaire who's been living as a ghost, hiding from a past that tried to kill him, literally. Two broken people, each running from their own nightmares, about to discover that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected packages. You see, this isn't just another story about a runaway bride. This is about what happens when two people who've been treated as pawns in other people's games finally decide to write their own rules. It's about the courage it takes to choose love over security, freedom over comfort, truth over the beautiful lies we tell ourselves. But freedom always comes with a price, and some people will stop at nothing to drag you back to the cage you escaped from. Clara and Alexander are about to learn that running away was just the beginning. Because the real battle starts when you decide you're worth fighting for. You're ready to discover what it really means to choose yourself, even when the whole world is telling you you're wrong. Because this story is going to challenge everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the price of true freedom. If you're enjoying stories like this that dig deep into the human experience, that show you what real transformation looks like, then make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're just getting started, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Picture this. You're standing at the altar, everyone's eyes on you, and you're supposed to be living your fairy tale moment. But what happens when that fairy tale feels more like a nightmare? That's exactly where Clara Bennett found herself on what should have been the happiest day of her life. There she was, looking absolutely stunning in that figure-hugging mermaid dress that cost more than most people's cars. Every detail was perfect. The pearls, the lace, the way the fabric caught the light streaming through those stained glass windows. But here's the thing about perfection. Sometimes it's just a beautiful prison in disguise. Clara wasn't marrying for love. Nope, this wasn't some romantic comedy where the girl gets the guy and they ride off into the sunset. This was business, plain and simple. Her family's company was drowning in debt, and Darman Whitmore, this cold, calculating businessman, was their lifeline. The catch, the price of salvation, was Clara herself. Now let me tell you something about Darman. This guy wasn't your typical groom. He had this arrogant air about him, like he owned everything and everyone around him. Picture someone who's never heard the word no in his entire life. Someone who treats people like chess pieces on his personal board. When Clara looked into his eyes that day, she didn't see love or even basic human warmth. All she saw was possession, like she was just another asset he was acquiring for his portfolio. Standing there in front of him, something clicked in Clara's mind. It hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a marriage, it was a life sentence. She could see her future stretching out before her. Years of being treated like a trophy wife, of having her voice silenced, of slowly disappearing until there was nothing left of the real Clara Bennett. Every dream she'd ever had would be suffocated under the weight of his expectations and control. That moment of realization was like a lightning bolt. Here she was, dressed like a princess, surrounded by flowers and fairy lights, but feeling more trapped than she'd ever felt in her entire life. The wedding march was playing. Guests were smiling expectantly. Cameras were flashing to capture what everyone thought was a perfect moment. But all Clara could think about was escape. You know that feeling when You're in a situation and suddenly everything becomes crystal clear. That's exactly what happened to Clara. All the months of being told what to wear, how to act, who to talk to, what to say, it all came crashing down on her. She realized she was about to sign away her soul. And for what? To save a family business that had never really valued her as more than a bargaining chip. That's when she did something absolutely crazy. In front of all those wedding guests, in front of her family who desperately needed this deal, in front of Darman's cold, expectant stare, she turned around and ran. Can you imagine the chaos? The collective gasp from the crowd, her mother's horrified expression, Darman's face turning red with rage and embarrassment. The priest stood there with his mouth hanging open, not sure whether to continue or call security. But Clara didn't care about any of that drama. All she knew was that she had to get out of there, and she had to do it right now. Running in a wedding dress isn't exactly easy, especially not in a mermaid style that hugs your legs like a second skin. But adrenaline's a powerful thing, and Clara found herself practically flying down that church aisle. The train of her dress was dragging behind her, getting caught on pews and flowers, but she didn't stop. She could hear people calling her name, but their voices seemed to fade into background noise. She burst through those heavy church doors and straight into a torrential downpour. The rain was coming down, like the heavens had opened up, and within seconds her perfect hair and makeup were ruined. The thousands of dollars spent on making her look like the perfect bride were washing away with every raindrop. But you know what? She'd never felt more free in her entire life. That's when she heard them, heavy footsteps behind her, men's voices shouting her name with authority. Damon's security team was after her. Of course he had security. Rich guys like him always do, and they weren't about to let their boss's investment walk away. These weren't just any security guards either. These were professionals who probably cost more per day than most people make in a month. Clara kicked off those expensive heels and ran barefoot down the street. The rain was making everything slippery, and that heavy dress was like carrying a wet blanket, but fear gave her wings. She could hear the men getting closer, their voices cutting through the sound of the storm, coordinating their search like she was some kind of fugitive. Then, out of nowhere, this old pickup truck came screeching around the corner. For a split second, Clara thought this was it. She was going to die right there in the street, still wearing her wedding dress. But the truck stopped just inches from her, and through the rain-streaked windshield, she saw him. The driver was nothing like the polished men she was used to. He had this rugged look about him, with deep, intense eyes that seemed to see right through all the wedding dress drama to the real person underneath. His hands on the steering wheel were calloused, working man's hands. His voice was rough when he rolled down the window and said, "Get in." Now, any sane person would think twice about jumping into a stranger's truck. But Clara wasn't thinking about safety or logic anymore. She was thinking about freedom, about escape, about getting as far away from Darman and his world as possible. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts, even when they're telling you to do something that seems crazy. She yanked open that passenger door and practically dove inside, soaking wet and shivering. The stranger didn't ask questions. Not about the wedding dress, not about why she was running barefoot in the rain, not about the men who were probably still looking for her. He just put the truck in gear and drove. There was something comforting about his silence. Like he understood that sometimes people need to run, and that's reason enough. As they pulled away, Clara caught a glimpse of Damon's security team standing there in the rain, looking frustrated and defeated. She could imagine Damon's reaction when they told him they'd lost her. For a moment she almost felt sorry for them. Almost. But then she remembered how they'd been ready to drag her back to a life she didn't want. The stranger drove in complete silence, taking them away from the city lights and into the darkness of winding country roads. The rain kept falling, and with each mile they traveled, Clara felt like she was shedding layers of her old life. The familiar buildings and landmarks disappeared, replaced by tall trees and darkness. But as the forest grew thicker around them and the silence stretched on, she couldn't help but wonder what she'd just gotten herself into. You know that feeling when you wake up somewhere completely unfamiliar and for a split second, you forget where you are. That's exactly what happened to Clara the next morning. She opened her eyes to rough wooden beams above her head, the scent of pine in the air, and the sound of birds chirping outside instead of city traffic. The events of the previous night came flooding back. The wedding, the rain, the escape, and this mysterious stranger who'd saved her from Damon's security team. She was lying on a simple but comfortable couch, covered with a thick woolen blanket that smelled like cedar and something distinctly masculine. The cabin around her was nothing like the luxury she was used to. No marble countertops, no designer furniture, no staff running around to cater to every whim. This place was simple, honest, and somehow felt more like home than any mansion she'd ever lived in. There was something about the worn wooden floors and handmade furniture that spoke of a life lived authentically. That's when she heard movement in the kitchen. The clink of dishes, the sound of coffee brewing. Her mysterious rescuer was awake, and Clara suddenly felt nervous. In the chaos of the night before, she hadn't really processed what she'd done. She'd jumped into a complete stranger's truck and let him bring her to his isolated cabin in the middle of nowhere. Her mother would have had a heart attack if she knew. She wrapped the blanket around herself and padded barefoot toward the kitchen, still wearing the slip she'd been given the night before. The wedding dress was nowhere to be seen, probably hanging somewhere to dry. When she appeared in the doorway, the man turned around, and she got her first clear look at him in daylight. Alexander. That's what he'd told her his name was during their brief conversation before she'd fallen asleep from exhaustion. He was probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that looked like he cut it himself and shoulders that suggested he was used to physical work. There was something about his eyes that made her think he'd seen more of life than most people, and not all of it had been pretty. "Coffee?" he asked, holding up a mug. His voice was still that same rough baritone from the night before, but there was something gentler about it in the morning light. Clara nodded, accepting the mug gratefully. The coffee was strong and black, nothing like the fancy lattes she was used to, but it warmed her from the inside out. They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, both of them probably wondering what to say next. "Look," Alexander said finally, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. "I don't know what kind of trouble you're running from, and frankly, it's none of my business. But this arrangement is temporary, just until you figure out your next move." One night, maybe two at most, there it was, the brush-off she'd been expecting. Clara felt her heart sink a little, though she wasn't sure why. She'd known this wasn't going to be permanent. She was a stranger to him, probably nothing but trouble waiting to happen. Of course, he'd want her gone as soon as possible, but here's the thing about Clara. She'd spent her whole life being told what to do, where to go, and when to leave. Something inside her rebelled against the idea of being dismissed so quickly, especially when she had nowhere else to go. For the first time in her life, she was going to fight for something she wanted. "What if I earn my keep?" she found herself saying. "I could cook, clean, help around the place. I know I don't look like much right now, but I'm not completely useless." Alexander raised an eyebrow, looking skeptical. "You know how to cook?" Clara hesitated. The truth was, she'd never really had to cook for herself. There had always been staff, or restaurants, or someone else taking care of meals. But how hard could it be, right? "Of course," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. That first day was, well, let's just say it was a learning experience. Clara's attempt at breakfast resulted in burned eggs and smoke filling the kitchen. Her effort to do laundry somehow turned all of Alexander's white shirts a lovely shade of pink. And don't even get me started on what happened when she tried to organize his workshop. But here's what was interesting. Alexander didn't yell at her. He didn't lecture her about being careless or useless like her family would have. He just quietly fixed what could be fixed, salvaged what could be salvaged, and showed her the right way to do things. There was a patience in his actions that she'd never experienced before. By the third day, yes, she'd managed to convince him to let her stay that long, Clara was starting to get the hang of things. Her pancakes were only slightly lopsided. She'd figured out the washing machine, and she'd only broken one mug. More importantly, she was starting to see the man behind the gruff exterior. Alexander would leave early in the morning to do whatever it was he did. She suspected he worked with his hands, given the calluses and the occasional sawdust in his hair. But in the evenings, he'd come back to find dinner waiting, even if it wasn't always edible, and the cabin tidier than it had been in months. There were these little moments that made Clara's heart skip a beat, like when he brought her wildflowers he'd found in the forest, claiming he thought she might like some color in the cabin, or when he noticed she was cold and wordlessly built up the fire without being asked, or the way he'd started leaving books on the coffee table, stories about adventure and romance that were so different from the business journals she was used to seeing around her father's house. But it was more than just his actions that drew her to him. It was the way he treated her. Alexander didn't see her as Clara Bennett, daughter of a failing businessman, or as Damon Whitmore's escaped bride. He just saw her as Clara, a woman who burned dinner sometimes and asked too many questions about how things worked, but who was trying her best to contribute and find her place in the world. For the first time in her life, Clara felt like she was being seen for who she really was, not for what she represented or what she could do for someone else's agenda. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. She'd catch herself watching Alexander when he thought she wasn't looking, wondering about his story, about what had brought him to this isolated place. The cabin that had felt rustic and foreign at first was starting to feel like a sanctuary. The simple routine of their days, coffee in the morning, meals together, quiet evenings by the fire, was more peaceful than any luxury vacation she'd ever taken. There was something deeply satisfying about falling asleep, tired from honest work, rather than exhausted from pretending to be someone she wasn't. But even in this growing bubble of contentment, Clara could feel something shifting in the air around them. The way Alexander sometimes got quiet when he checked his phone, the way his jaw would tighten when certain topics came up in conversation. There was a tension building, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful little world was about to be tested in ways neither of them were prepared for. You know that saying about all good things coming to an end? Well, Clara was about to learn just how true that could be. For almost a week now, she'd been living in what felt like a different world, a world where she could breathe freely, where she didn't have to watch every word she said or worry about disappointing someone. Life in the cabin had developed its own rhythm. Clara would wake up to the smell of Alexander's coffee, stronger and more honest than any expensive blend she'd ever tasted. They'd share breakfast. Her cooking had improved dramatically, though she still couldn't flip pancakes quite like he could. Then Alexander would head out to work on whatever project he was tackling that day, and Clara would spend her time making the cabin feel more like a home. She'd discovered she actually enjoyed the simple tasks that had once seemed beneath her. There was something deeply satisfying about hanging laundry on the line and watching it dance in the mountain breeze, or about kneading bread dough until her hands ached. These weren't the kind of accomplishments that would impress anyone at a cocktail party, but they made her feel useful, needed, real. But it was the evenings that Clara treasured most. When Alexander would come back, often with sawdust in his hair or dirt under his fingernails, he'd find her waiting with dinner and stories about her day. They'd sit by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, books they'd read, places they'd dreamed of visiting, childhood memories that made them laugh. Clara found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, like how she used to sneak out of her bedroom as a child just to sit in the garden and watch the stars, or how she'd always wondered what it would be like to travel somewhere without bodyguards and itineraries planned down to the minute. Alexander listened without judgment, occasionally sharing his own stories in that careful way of his, like he was testing how much trust was safe to give. There were moments, there were definitely moments, when the air between them would change, like when Clara would catch him watching her as she read by the firelight, or when their hands would accidentally touch as they passed dishes at dinner. The attraction was undeniable, crackling between them like electricity. But neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge it out loud. One particular afternoon, Clara was trying to reach a book from a high shelf when the chair she was standing on started to wobble dangerously. Before she could fall, strong arms caught her, pulling her against a solid chest that smelled like pine and something uniquely masculine. For a moment that lasted both forever and not nearly long enough, they stood there frozen, her hands pressed against his shoulders, his arms around her waist. Alexander's eyes were darker than she'd ever seen them, and Clara could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. The world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, to the warmth of his skin through his shirt and the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and breakable. Then, as if remembering himself, Alexander stepped back, clearing his throat and mumbling something about being more careful on chairs. But Clara wasn't thinking about chairs or books or being careful. She was thinking about how safe she'd felt in his arms, how right it had seemed to be there. She was thinking about how, for the first time in her life, she was falling for someone who saw her as more than a transaction or a trophy. That's when their little bubble of peace started showing cracks. It began with the newspaper. Alexander had gone into town for supplies, something he did once or twice a week. He'd come back quieter than usual, and Clara noticed he kept glancing at the local paper he'd brought back, like it contained bad news. When she finally got a look at it while he was outside chopping wood, her blood ran cold. There it was, on the front page of even this small-town paper, her wedding photo, looking like the perfect bride she was supposed to have been. The headline read, "Local Businessman Searches for Missing Bride," but it was the article that made her stomach drop. Darman hadn't just reported her missing. He'd painted himself as a concerned fiancé worried about his beloved's mental state. According to him, Clara had been under tremendous stress and had suffered what he delicately termed a nervous breakdown. He was offering a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return, and he'd hired a team of private investigators to aid in the search. But here's what really made Clara's hands shake as she read. Darman had mentioned that Clara might be traveling with a mysterious accomplice who could be considered dangerous. He was suggesting that whoever had helped her might be taking advantage of her compromised mental state. The article made it sound like she was a victim who needed to be rescued, not a woman who'd made a choice to save herself. Clara felt sick. Not only was Darman trying to control the narrative, but he was putting Alexander in danger just by association. If someone recognized her, if they connected her to Alexander, he could be arrested as an accomplice to, kidnapping? She wasn't even sure what Darman could legally claim. But she knew men like him had ways of making the law work in their favor. When Alexander came back inside, Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with the paper in front of her, her face pale as moonlight. He took one look at her expression and knew their borrowed time was running out. "How long do you think we have?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander sat down across from her, his jaw tight. "Hard to say. This is a small town. People talk, and that reward money is substantial. Someone might have already called it in." That night they barely slept. Every sound outside made them tense. Was that a car engine in the distance? Were those footsteps on the porch, or just the wind moving through the trees? Clara found herself memorizing everything about the cabin, about Alexander, as if she could hold on to these moments through sheer force of will. The next evening, their worst fears started coming true. Alexander was checking the perimeter around the cabin, something he'd started doing since seeing the newspaper, when he spotted them, shadows moving through the trees, too purposeful to be wildlife, too coordinated to be coincidence. He made it back to the cabin just as Clara was setting the table for dinner, moving with the calm efficiency of someone used to danger. "Pack light and pack fast," he told her, his voice steady but urgent. "We've got company coming, and they're not the friendly kind." Clara's hands were shaking as she threw a few essentials into a backpack. Some clothes, the few personal items she'd managed to acquire. But even as fear coursed through her veins, there was something else there too. Alexander wasn't telling her to surrender, wasn't suggesting she give up and go back to her old life. He was ready to run with her, to keep protecting her, even though it would have been easier to just hand her over. As they prepared to leave their little sanctuary behind, Clara realized that the real danger wasn't just Darman finding her. It was how much she'd come to depend on this life, on this man, on the feeling of being truly cared for. Because now that she'd tasted what it felt like to be free, to be valued for who she was, rather than what she represented, she knew she'd fight tooth and nail before she let anyone drag her back to the cage she'd escaped from. The shadows in the forest were getting closer, and their peaceful chapter was about to become something much more dangerous. There's something about sharing your darkest moments with another person that either breaks you apart or bonds you together forever. Clara was about to discover which one it would be for her and Alexander. They'd managed to slip away from whoever was lurking in the forest, but the close call had shaken them both more than they wanted to admit. Now they were holed up in an even more remote cabin, one that Alexander seemed to know about but had never mentioned before. The place was smaller, more rustic, with thick walls that seemed built to keep secrets in and danger out. Clara watched as Alexander secured the windows and checked the locks with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. There was something different about him now, a hardness in his eyes, a tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man who'd been running from something long before she'd ever entered his life. "You're not just some guy who likes living off the grid, are you?" she asked quietly, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed that dominated the small space. Alexander paused in his security check, his hand resting on the window latch. For a long moment, Clara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he turned around, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. There was pain there, old and deep, the kind that never really heals. "No," he said simply. "I'm not." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Outside, the wind was picking up, making the cabin walls creak softly. Clara realized that this moment felt like a turning point. Whatever Alexander was about to tell her would change everything between them. He sat down in the single chair across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. When he started talking, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it, like he was afraid the walls themselves might betray his secrets. 3 years ago, I wasn't Alexander the Hermit living in a cabin in the woods. I was Alexander Steele, CEO of Steele Construction, one of the fastest-growing companies on the West Coast. I had everything: money, success, a mansion in the hills, cars that cost more than most people's houses. And I had a best friend, a guy named Ryan Morrison, who'd been with me since college. Clara felt her heart start to race. She'd heard that name before. Steele Construction had been in the news a few years back. Something about a scandal and a missing CEO. She'd never paid much attention to business news back then, too wrapped up in her own family's problems to care about someone else's corporate drama. "Ryan wasn't just my business partner," Alexander continued, his voice getting rougher with each word. "He was like a brother to me. We built that company from nothing, working 18-hour days, sleeping in the office, believing we were going to change the world one building at a time. I trusted him with everything. My business, my secrets, my life." The way Alexander said those words made Clara's chest tighten. She recognized that particular kind of pain, the bewilderment that comes when someone you love betrays you so completely that you start questioning your own judgment about everything. "What happened?" she asked softly. Alexander's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "What happened is, I found out that my best friend, my brother, had been stealing from the company for months. Not just money, contracts, clients, proprietary information. He'd been building his own competing firm right under my nose, using everything he'd learned from working with me." Clara felt sick. She'd grown up around business, around men who thought loyalty was just another commodity to be bought and sold. But even she was shocked by the level of betrayal Alexander was describing. But that wasn't the worst part, Alexander continued, standing up and beginning to pace the small space like a caged animal. The worst part was that when I confronted him, when I told him I was going to expose everything, he tried to kill me. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Clara found herself holding her breath, waiting for him to continue. It was supposed to look like an accident. A late-night drive up a mountain road, steering that goes out at exactly the wrong moment. A car that plunges into a ravine and burns until there's nothing left to investigate. Alexander's voice was completely flat now, emotionless, like he was reciting facts from someone else's life. "But you survived," Clara whispered. "Barely. I should have died in that crash. Would have, if a park ranger hadn't happened to be in the area and seen the smoke." By the time I got out of the hospital, Ryan had already taken over. He'd spun some story about me having a nervous breakdown, about needing to step in to save the company from my erratic behavior. He had forged documents, fake testimony from employees he'd bribed or threatened. By the time I was strong enough to fight back, he'd already won. Clara felt tears burning her eyes. She'd thought her own family's betrayal was bad, being sold off like livestock to save a failing business. But at least her parents hadn't tried to actually murder her. "So what did you do?" "I disappeared. Changed my name. Used some offshore accounts Ryan didn't know about to buy this place and a few others like it. As far as the world knows, Alexander Steele died in that car crash, even if it took a few extra months to make it official." He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "I've been dead for 3 years, Clara, and I was fine with that, fine with being a ghost until what? Until a runaway bride crashed into my life and made me remember what it felt like to be alive." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She could see the truth in his eyes, the vulnerability he was showing her by admitting how much she'd come to mean to him. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely overwhelming all at once. "Alexander," she started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. You asked why I'm helping you, why I'm risking exposure by keeping you safe. It's because I see myself in you, Clara. I see someone who was betrayed by the people who were supposed to love and protect them. I see someone who had to choose between a life that was slow death or taking a leap into the unknown." Clara felt something break open inside her chest. All her life, she'd been surrounded by people who saw her as a means to an end. Her parents saw her as a way to save their business. Damon saw her as a trophy to acquire. Even her so-called friends had only been interested in her connections and money. But Alexander saw her as a person, saw her pain and her strength and her desperate need for freedom. "You want to know the real reason my family was so eager to marry me off to Damon?" she heard herself saying. "It wasn't just about saving the business. It was because they'd finally found a way to get rid of their disappointment of a daughter and make money doing it." Now it was Alexander's turn to look shocked. Clara had never said those words out loud before. Had barely even admitted them to herself. "My whole life, I was never good enough," she continued, the words pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. "I wasn't smart enough to help with the business, wasn't social enough to be a proper society wife, wasn't pretty enough to land a rich husband on my own merits. I was just there, a burden they had to support until they could figure out how to monetize me." Alexander moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed beside her. "That's not true, isn't it? When Damon made his offer, marry me and assume our debts, do you think anyone asked what I wanted? Do you think anyone cared that I barely knew him, that he treated me like a piece of furniture he was considering purchasing?" Clara's voice was shaking now, years of suppressed pain finally finding its voice. "I was so grateful when he showed even the slightest interest that I almost convinced myself it was love." "How pathetic is that?" "It's not pathetic," Alexander said firmly. "It's human. When you're starving for affection, for someone to see your worth, you'll take whatever scraps you can get." The understanding in his voice broke the last of Clara's defenses. She looked up at him through tears and saw someone who truly understood what it meant to be betrayed by the people who were supposed to care about you most. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" she said with a shaky laugh. "The dead billionaire and the runaway bride." "Clara," Alexander said, reaching out to cup her face with his rough, calloused hands. "You're not running anymore. You're choosing. There's a difference." In that moment, sitting in a tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere, Clara felt more seen and understood than she ever had in any mansion or ballroom. Alexander wasn't looking at her like she was damaged goods or a problem to be solved. He was looking at her like she was precious, like she was worth protecting, like she was worth loving. But even as they sat there in their bubble of shared understanding, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their confessions had changed something fundamental between them. They weren't just two people hiding from their pasts anymore. They were two people who had something real to lose. And in her experience, that was when life got really dangerous. You know that feeling when you think you've finally found peace, only to have your past come crashing back like a freight train. That's exactly what was about to happen to Alexander and Clara. Their moment of vulnerability, of sharing their deepest scars, had brought them closer than ever. But sometimes, getting close to someone means their demons become your demons too. It started with Alexander's phone buzzing at 3 a.m. Clara woke up to see him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the screen with an expression she'd never seen before. Pure, cold fury mixed with something that looked almost like fear. "What is it?" she whispered, but she already knew. Somehow, she just knew that their borrowed time had run out. Alexander turned the phone toward her, and Clara felt her blood turn to ice. The message was simple, just a few words, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. "Found you, brother. Time to come home." But it was the photo attached that made Clara's stomach drop. It was a picture of her, taken with a telephoto lens, hanging laundry outside their first cabin. She was smiling in the photo, looking happier and more relaxed than she'd felt in years. Someone had been watching them, studying them, learning their routines. "Ryan," Alexander said, his voice flat and emotionless. "He knows about you. He knows about us." Clara felt like she couldn't breathe. "How is that possible?" "I thought you said he believed you were dead. I thought he did." Alexander stood up and began pacing, running his hands through his hair. "But Ryan's always been smart, always been thorough. He probably had people monitoring any transactions from my old accounts, any property purchases that might trace back to me. And now he knows you're alive and he knows I'm with you." Alexander's jaw tightened. "It's worse than that, Clara. Ryan doesn't do anything without a reason. If he's reaching out now, it's because he needs something from me. And the fact that he's mentioning you means he sees you as leverage." The phone buzzed again. "Another message? She's pretty, Alex. Shame if something happened to her because you're being stubborn." Clara felt sick. Once again, she was being used as a pawn in someone else's game, a bargaining chip to force a man to do something he didn't want to do. But this time was different. This time, she actually cared about the man who was being threatened. "He's going to use me to draw you out, isn't he?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Over my dead body." Alexander's voice was harder than she'd ever heard it. "I won't let him hurt you, Clara. I won't let anyone hurt you ever again." But even as he said the words, Clara could see the conflict in his eyes. Alexander had been hiding for 3 years, building a life in the shadows, staying safe by staying invisible. Now Ryan was threatening to destroy that safety, and they both knew there was only one thing Ryan wanted badly enough to risk exposing Alexander's survival. The business. The empire they'd built together, the company that Ryan had stolen and claimed as his own. For 3 years, he'd been running it, but Clara suspected he'd never been able to fill the void that Alexander's creative genius had left behind. Maybe the company was struggling. Maybe Ryan needed his old partner back, needed the brilliant mind that had made steel construction what it was. "What does he want?" Clara asked. Alexander's laugh was bitter. "The same thing he's always wanted. Everything I have, everything I am, but with me under his control this time. He tried to kill me because I was going to expose him. Now he probably thinks he can blackmail me into coming back, into helping him rebuild what he's destroyed." The phone buzzed a third time. "You have 48 hours to contact me. After that, your girlfriend becomes my guest. You remember what kind of host I can be?" Clara saw Alexander's hands clench into fists. She could practically see the memories playing behind his eyes. The crash, the betrayal, the months of recovery, both physical and emotional. Ryan had already tried to kill him once. There was no telling what he'd do to Clara if he got his hands on her. "We could run," Clara suggested desperately. "Disappear completely. Change our names, go somewhere he'll never find us, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, always wondering when he'll find us again." Alexander shook his head. "That's not living, Clara. That's just existing. And you deserve so much more than that." But Clara could see what he was really thinking, could read the resignation that was starting to creep into his expression. He was considering giving himself up, trading his freedom for her safety. The thought made her feel sick and angry and terrified all at once. "Don't you dare," she said fiercely. "Don't you dare even think about sacrificing yourself for me. Clara, no." She stood up, facing him with all the strength she'd found in these weeks of freedom. "I didn't escape one controlling man just to watch another one destroy himself trying to protect me. We're in this together, Alexander. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Alexander looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a victim to be protected, but as a partner who could stand beside him in battle. There was surprise in his eyes, and pride, and something else that made Clara's heart skip a beat. "You have no idea what you're signing up for," he said softly. "Ryan isn't like Damon. Damon might be cold and controlling, but he's predictable. He's dangerous in ways that go deeper than business. He enjoys hurting people, especially people I care about. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." The phone buzzed again. Tick-tock. "Alex, 47 hours and counting." Clara watched as Alexander stared at the message, and she could see the moment when something shifted in his expression. The fear was still there, but it was being overtaken by something else, determination, maybe even a hint of the ruthless businessman he used to be. "You're right," he said finally. "We face this together. But Clara, you need to understand, once we start down this path, there's no going back. Ryan won't stop until one of us is dead, I know." And she did know. She could feel it in her bones, the way you know a storm is coming before you see the clouds. Their peaceful chapter was over. Whatever came next would test everything they'd built together, everything they'd come to mean to each other. But for the first time since receiving Ryan's messages, Clara felt something other than fear. She felt angry. She was tired of being used as leverage, tired of being treated like a helpless victim, tired of running from men who thought they could control her life. "So what's the plan?" she asked. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, and Clara could see him making a decision that would change everything. "We're going to give Ryan exactly what he wants," he said finally. "We're going to bring Alexander Steele back from the dead." The phone buzzed one more time. "I'm so looking forward to our reunion, brother, and to meeting your lovely companion." Clara felt a chill run down her spine, but she lifted her chin and met Alexander's eyes. They'd found each other in the darkness, two broken people who'd made each other whole. Now they were going to have to fight for the right to stay that way, and Clara was surprised to realize that she was ready for that fight. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is break both of your hearts to keep them alive. Alexander was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. The final message from Ryan came at dawn, just as Clara was making coffee and pretending that everything was going to be okay. The sound of Alexander's phone buzzing made them both freeze. Like hearing a death knell in the distance, Alexander read the message in silence, his face going pale, then handed the phone to Clara without a word. The text was simple, direct, and absolutely terrifying. "Change of plans, brother. I know exactly where you are. Your little cabin hideaway isn't as secret as you thought. You have 1 hour to send your girlfriend away, alone and unprotected, or I come for both of you. Your choice, save her or damn her." Attached was a photograph that made Clara's blood run cold. It was taken from the tree line around their current cabin, showing both of them through the kitchen window just minutes ago. Someone had been watching them, close enough to count the freckles on Clara's nose, close enough to put a bullet through the glass if they'd wanted to. "He's been playing with us," Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet. "All this time, letting us think we were staying one step ahead. He's been tracking our every move. This was never about giving me time to decide. This was about cornering us exactly where he wanted us." Clara felt sick. "So what do we do?" "We don't do anything," Alexander said, standing up with a finality that made Clara's heart sink. "You're leaving now?" "Absolutely not. Clara, listen to me." "No, you listen to me." Clara stood up too, facing him with all the fierce determination she'd discovered in herself over these past weeks. "I'm not running away and leaving you to face this alone. We're partners, remember? We face this together." Alexander's expression was anguished. "Don't you understand? He's using you as bait. As long as you're here, I can't think clearly, can't make the hard choices I might need to make. You're not just in danger, you're making me weaker." The words hit Clara like a slap. "Is that really what you think? That I make you weak?" "I think you make me human," Alexander said softly. "And right now, I can't afford to be human. I need to be the cold, calculating bastard I used to be if I'm going to outsmart Ryan. But I can't do that if I'm terrified every second that he's going to hurt you." Clara could see the logic in what he was saying, could understand the impossible position Ryan had put them in. But everything in her rebelled against the idea of abandoning Alexander when he needed her most. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. Alexander's phone buzzed again. 55 minutes. "Alex, tick-tock." "There isn't." Alexander moved to the closet and pulled out a backpack, starting to stuff it with clothes and supplies. "You're taking my truck. You're driving to the city, and you're disappearing until this is over." "And what if it's never over? What if Ryan kills you? What if I never see you again?" Alexander stopped packing and looked at her, really looked at her, like he was trying to memorize her face. "Then you'll know that you were the best thing that ever happened to me. You'll know that these weeks with you were worth more than all the years I had before." Clara felt tears burning her eyes. "Don't talk like that. Don't talk like you're already dead. I'm not planning to die, Clara, but I am planning to end this one way or another. And I can't do that if I'm worried about keeping you safe." The phone buzzed. 50 minutes. Alexander zipped up the backpack and held it out to her. "There's money in there, enough to last you months. New identity documents. Don't ask how I got them. And this," he pulled a small device from his pocket. "It's a GPS tracker. When this is over, if I'm still alive, I'll activate it and you'll be able to find me." Clara stared at the backpack like it was a snake. Taking it would mean accepting that this was really happening, that their time together was really over. "I won't do it," she said. "I won't leave you." Alexander closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, Clara saw something there that broke her heart. He was shutting down, becoming the cold businessman he'd warned her about. "Then I'll make the choice for you," he said. Before Clara could react, he'd grabbed her wrist and was pulling her toward the door. She fought him, but he was stronger and more determined than she'd ever seen him. "Alexander, please." "I'm sorry," he said, and she could hear the pain in his voice even as he forced her toward the truck. "I'm so sorry, Clara, but I'd rather have my heart broken than your blood on my hands." He practically lifted her into the driver's seat, threw the backpack in after her, and slammed the door. Clara immediately tried to get out, but he was holding the door shut. "Drive," he said through the window. "Drive now and don't look back." "I hate you for this," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "Good," Alexander replied, though his own eyes were suspiciously bright. "A hate will keep you alive." The phone in his hand buzzed again. 45 minutes. "I see the truck still there, Alex." Alexander stepped back from the truck, his face a mask of cold determination. "Go, Clara. If you ever loved me, go." Clara looked at him through the windshield, at this man who'd saved her from one nightmare only to walk willingly into another. She could see the fear he was trying to hide, the love he was trying to suppress, the desperate hope that he was making the right choice. With shaking hands, she started the truck. Alexander stepped further back, giving her room to leave, but his eyes never left hers. Clara put the truck in drive, then rolled down the window. "Alexander Steele," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "You better survive this, because I'm not done with you yet." For just a moment his mask slipped, and she saw the real Alexander, the man who'd caught her when she fell, who taught her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. "I love you, Clara Bennett," he said. "Don't ever forget that." Clara drove away then, watching in the rearview mirror as Alexander became smaller and smaller until the trees swallowed him completely. But even as she put miles between them, even as her heart shattered with every revolution of the wheels, she was already making plans of her own. Alexander thought he was protecting her by sending her away. But Clara had learned something important during their time together. She wasn't the helpless victim everyone had always assumed she was. She was a woman who'd found her strength, who discovered what she was willing to fight for, and she was willing to fight for Alexander Steele, even if it meant fighting against him to do it. Back at the cabin, Alexander watched the dust settle on the empty road, then turned to face the forest where Ryan's people were undoubtedly watching. For 3 years, he'd been running, hiding, letting the world think he was dead. But Clara had brought him back to life, had reminded him what it meant to have something worth protecting. Now it was time to stop running and start fighting. Alexander Steele was about to rise from the dead, and Ryan Morrison was going to discover that some ghosts come back with a vengeance. The war for their future was about to begin. So here we are, at the end of Clara and Alexander's incredible journey from runaway bride and hidden billionaire to two people who chose love over everything else that seemed safer. But let me ask you something. What's the real lesson here? What can we take from their story that actually changes how we live our own lives? Here's what strikes me most about Clara and Alexander. They both had to lose everything they thought they wanted before they could find what they actually needed. Clara had to walk away from financial security, family approval, and social status. Alexander had to give up his empire, his identity, even his own name. And in that loss, in that terrifying leap into the unknown, they found something that no amount of money or status could ever buy. They found themselves. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. How many of us are living Clara's life before she ran? How many of us are standing at our own altars? Whether that's a job that drains our soul, a relationship that diminishes us, or expectations that have nothing to do with who we really are. And we're just going through the motions because it seems safer than the alternative. Think about it. When was the last time you made a decision based on what you actually wanted, not what you thought you should want? When was the last time you chose the uncertain path because it felt true to who you are, even when everyone around you was telling you to play it safe? Clara and Alexander's story isn't just about romance, it's about rebellion. It's about refusing to be a commodity in someone else's game. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing. Because staying in a situation that's killing your spirit slowly is just another form of suicide. Here's what I want you to understand. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Clara was terrified when she ran from that church. Alexander was terrified when he chose to fight Ryan instead of hiding forever. But they did it anyway, because they finally understood that the pain of staying the same was greater than the pain of change. So let me challenge you with some questions. What are you running from that you should be running toward instead? What prison are you calling safety? What version of yourself are you hiding because you're afraid of what people will think if you show up authentically? And here's the big one. If you knew that 1 year from now you'd regret not taking the leap you're thinking about right now, what would you do differently today? Clara discovered something powerful when she stopped trying to be the perfect daughter, the perfect fiancée, the perfect victim. She discovered that she was already perfect exactly as she was. Alexander learned that hiding from life isn't the same as living it, no matter how safe it feels. The truth is, most of us are living smaller lives than we're capable of because we're scared of disappointing people who probably aren't even paying that much attention to our choices anyway. We're staying in situations that don't serve us because the devil we know feels safer than the angel we don't. But what if, just what if, you're exactly one bold decision away from a life that actually fits you? Your story doesn't have to look like Clara and Alexander's. You don't have to run from a wedding or fake your own death. But you do have to decide, are you going to keep living for everyone else's comfort, or are you finally ready to bet on yourself? Because here's what I know for sure. The world needs the real you, not the version of you that everyone else thinks you should be. And the people who are meant to be in your life will love you for your courage, not judge you for your choices. So what's it going to be? Are you ready to stop being the supporting character in your own life story? If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life differently, then do me a favor. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We're here to tell the stories that matter, the ones that show you what's possible when you choose courage over comfort. And trust me, we're just getting started with stories that will challenge you, inspire you, and maybe even change the direction of your entire life.